Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So now let's discuss the anatomy and the neural organization of the spinal cord. It is one of the it's the simplest part of the central nervous system, and but it is the location where three very important neural systems whose connections are invariably spread throughout the CNS, and we'll discuss them one by one. And let's come to the fundamental anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is housed in the vertebral canal. It is surrounded on all sides by the vertebral bodies of the vertebra, which form a canal, and the spinal cord runs in that canal. It is continuous with the medulla at the foramen magnum. When the medulla crosses the foramen magnum, it becomes the spinal cord, and it terminates at the second lumbar vertebra of the adult spinal column in the adult, and that part which tapers towards the lumbar 2 L2 vertebra is known as the conus medullaris. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves which arise segmentally from the spinal cord. There are 8 cervical pairs, 12 thoracic pairs, 5 lumbar pairs, 5 sacral pairs, and 1 coccygeal pair. And in the entire central nervous system, there is a division between division of the various structures inside the CNS. And the CNS is basically divided into the gray matter and the white matter. And this applies to all parts of the CNS. The gray matter in the spinal cord is centrally located in a butterfly-shaped structure, or an H-shaped structure. That is the gray matter. And what is the gray matter? Gray matter actually is the cell bodies of the neuronal cell bodies, and the dendrites. The dendrites plus the neuronal cell bodies, they constitute the gray matter, and the proximal part of the axons also. The remaining axons, they are forming the white matter. They surround the gray matter. The white matter surrounds the gray matter on all sides, because it is actually the axons of those neuronal cell bodies which are going to their target organs. So they form bundles of fibers, nerve fibers, fasciculi and funiculi, and they ascend or descend in the spinal cord to whatever location they want to go. So now let's look at the fundamental anatomy of the spinal cord and its roots, the spinal nerves. As you can see that this is a cross section, and the cross section of the spinal cord is showing the gray matter, which is in the form of an H. It forms an H shape or a butterfly shape, and this is the surrounding the gray matter is the white matter. This is the white matter, this is the gray matter, and there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and the spinal nerves, each spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. Mixed nerve in the sense that it contains both sensory as well as motor fibers. So since these are the branches of the spinal nerves, this is the dorsal ramus, this is the ventral ramus, and both have both sensory, they're mixed fibers. This is the sensory fiber, the blue one, which is coming into the dorsal root ganglion over here, and the red fibers are the motor fibers. So each spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. It contains both sensory fibers as well as motor fibers. So therefore, each spinal nerve consists of 2 roots. One is the dorsal root and one is the ventral root. The ventral root contains the motor fibers, and the dorsal root contains all the sensory fibers. So as you can see, the dorsal root, the central process shown over here in the blue or purple color, the central process of the dorsal root ganglion neurons, they are entering the spinal cord at the dorsal part of the spinal cord and the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and they are going into the gray matter. Their axons are going into the gray matter, and since the dorsal root is derived from it's a sensory root, it is derived from the neural crest cells. Therefore, logically, they're located outside the central nervous system. They're outside the spinal cord. Here, as you can see, the spinal cord consists of it's a part of the central nervous system. That all the dorsal root ganglia, the dorsal roots are present outside the CNS because they are derived from the neural crest cells. So the dorsal root ganglia and the neuronal cell bodies all are present in ganglia, which are present outside the CNS, as you can see. And the ventral root, all the neuronal cell bodies of all the ventral roots, they are located within the gray matter of the spinal cord. Since they are derived from the neural tube, so their cell bodies will be present inside the CNS, as you can see, inside the gray matter, somewhere in the gray matter of the ventral horn. And it's their axons which course into the ventral roots, and then they reach the spinal nerves, and from the spinal nerves they reach their target organs. So now let's look at the structure of the gray matter in some detail. The gray matter is divided into the dorsal, the ventral, and the intermediate horns. The dorsal horn is the sensory horn. As you can see over here, it's the sensory horn, and all the dorsal root ganglia and the neurons present in the dorsal root ganglia, their central processes, they enter the dorsal root, and then they enter the dorsal horn, and they connect the periphery. As you can see, this is unipolar neuron. It has a central axon with two processes. One process is going to the periphery, and it is in connection with the receptors present in the periphery: touch, pain, temperature, and pressure receptors, which are present in the skin, they're present in the tendons, they're present in the skeletal muscles, all the peripheral receptors. They are gathering the information. When they get stimulated, they send their information through these peripheral processes of the dorsal root ganglia, and this information flows down from over here into the dorsal root ganglion, the unipolar, and the dorsal root ganglia. They send this information to the center, and they send all this information which they are gathering from the peripheral receptors into the dorsal horn. As you can see, all the sensory information from the peripheral receptors: pain, temperature, pressure, touch, 2-point discrimination, proprioception, all these receptors, when they get stimulated, they send their information and it travels from the spinal nerve, and it is traveling through the spinal nerve and back to the dorsal root ganglia. And the dorsal root ganglia, then they're relaying that information to the center, and all that information ends up into the dorsal horn. So the dorsal horn is the sensory horn, and the ventral horn is the motor horn, and the ventral horn contains fibers that go to the ventral horn contains cell bodies whose axons are going to innervate skeletal muscles under voluntary control. So the skeletal muscles which are under your voluntary control, they're going to be stimulated by neurons whose cell bodies are present in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and their axons, they course through the ventral root and they reach a skeletal muscle that they're going to innervate. The intermediate horn, as you can see, the intermediate horn is is mixed. It is both motor and sensory. The dorsal horn is purely sensory. The ventral horn is purely motor, but the intermediate horn is mixed. The intermediate horn is mixed. It contains motor fibers as well as sensory fibers. The motor fibers are the preganglionic autonomic neurons, which are sympathetic neurons. They are present at the T1 to L2 levels and the S2, S3, and S4 levels. These are the parasympathetic neurons. The parasympathetic neurons, they emerge from the S2, 3, and 4 segments, and the sympathetic preganglionic autonomic neurons, they arise from the T1 to L2 levels. So these are the motor fibers that are coming from the intermediate horn, and they are part of the autonomic nervous system. Then there are some sensory neurons that are known as the Clark's nucleus. They are present in the intermediate horn, and they are also present from the T1 to L2 level, and they are going to take the information from the periphery to the cerebellum. Now, these are some of the terms that one should be familiar with. One is the conus medullaris, as we talked about it. It is the caudal end of the spinal cord, and the S3 to S5 segments of the spinal. It contains the S3 to S5 segments of the spinal cord. Here is when the spinal cord ends at the L2 vertebra, level of the L2 vertebra. So the chorda equina, these are the ventral and the dorsal roots of the lumbosacral and coccygeal spinal nerves, which emerge from the conus medullaris, and they exit through their respective intervertebral foramina to supply their respective areas. And chorda equina means the tail of a horse. Equinus means horse. Chorda means the tail, caudal end of the horse. It's like a horse tail, because the spinal cord ends there, and it's just like the hair coming out of the horse's tail. And those hairs are the nerve roots, and the nerve roots, they extend downwards, and they exit the respective intervertebral foramina and supply, because the spinal cord is going to end at L2. So below L2, the nerve roots continue downwards, and they exit through the intervertebral foramina, and they supply their respective segments. The filum terminale, or terminale, is a spial extension of the chorda equina, and it tethers the spinal cord to the bottom of the vertebral column up to the S2 segment. The S2 vertebra, the final terminale attaches to the S2 vertebra, and it anchors the chorda equina, and it's anchoring the spinal cord to the bone over here to give it support. So that is the filum terminale. The dorsal root ganglia contains the cell bodies of all primary sensory neurons and the derivatives of the neural crest cells. That's why they're located outside the CNS, as we talked about. Then we have dorsal and ventral roots. Each segment has a pair of dorsal and ventral roots. The pairs come out, they join together to form spinal nerves, and then the spinal nerves, they have both sensory and motor fibers, and they divide into the ventral and the dorsal rami. Then the dorsal horn, as we talked about, contains all the sensory neurons present in the dorsal horn, and all the motor fibers, they're present in the ventral horn. And the intermediate horn, which is not listed over here, is a mixed horn which contains both motor fibers. The motor fibers are the autonomic neurons, preganglionic autonomic neurons, and the sensory neurons, they are taking sensory information to the cerebellum. And then this slide helps us in identifying which section of the spinal cord that we're looking at. The spinal cord is enlarged in two areas. One is the cervical area and one is the lumbar area, which is understandable because all the muscles of the upper limb, since they are more skeletal muscles in the upper limb and the lower limbs. They have to be supplied by nerves. So it is logical that ventral horns through which these fibers are going to come, they're going to be larger in size because more muscles to innervate. So that's why the spinal cord is enlarged in these areas, in the cervical segments from C5 to T1 levels. And this enlargement, it forms the brachial plexus of nerves, which sends all the fibers to the muscles of the upper limbs. And from L2 to S3, here again, the spinal cord is enlarged in this segment, and this is known as the lumbar enlargement from L2 to S3. And fibers, they supply or innervate the lumbosacral plexuses. They form the lumbosacral plexus, which supply the muscles of the lower limb. And this diagram again is a three-dimensional view of the spinal cord, showing everything over here pretty much. As you can see, the gray matter, H-shaped gray matter with the dorsal horn, the ventral horn, and the intermediate horn, is surrounded by the white matter, and the rootlets coming out, forming each ventral and dorsal root is connected to the spinal cord by small rootlets. Now those rootlets, they join together, they form the ventral root and the dorsal roots, and the ventral and the dorsal roots, they join together to form the spinal nerves, as you can see over here.